The turnaround has been a lot faster for this video, so I apologise for the comparative lack of progress here on the intro. I was just very keen to discuss this watch. Some advance warning for the video. I've been very keen to get it made this week, but I've also been quite unwell, so I apologise if my voice is worse than normal. It's definitely taken more than a few takes to get through this without audible coughing on the recording. This video is going to focus on the San Martin World Timer. Some of you will no doubt have heard about the brand before, and I want to start by making it clear that this is not a sponsored video. I don't think that's really that hard to believe for such a small channel, but I realise that some people might be sceptical when dealing with an AliExpress brand. Personally, I've had positive experiences with AliExpress brand watches, just one poor experience with a seller. If watches like this interest you, my first piece of advice would be to make sure you always purchase through the official seller's pages. Believe me, there is a difference, even if the adverts look very similar. I purchased this watch after browsing the 11/11 sale this year, which is AliExpress's biggest event of the year. Having said that, I actually purchased this second-hand through eBay at a significant markdown. I know it won't be to everyone's tastes. A lot of people think a dial and a bezel like this is far too busy. But I'm a sucker for complications that I don't own. And while texture and simplicity is normally my go-to, there is something about a cluttered but organised dial that I can appreciate. I'm a fan of the Mido Ocean style world timers and the Rado Captain Cook Overpole for that reason. Though I don't think I'd be willing to risk paying that kind of price tag without some wear time with a busy dial to see if I actually like it. This is where the San Martin comes in for me. But I think it might be enough to scratch the itch for a world timer without the need for any further purchases. This is my first San Martin, and I'm rapidly starting to understand their reputation as the best AliExpress brand. I mentioned last video that for new purchases, I'd be running watches through my own form of a gauntlet. Do they get a place in my collection, or are they going to be sold on again? I'm going to experiment with a slightly different video style today, and we're going to weigh up what I see as the pros and cons of this watch. So I'd like to introduce you to my basic setup. I'm going to focus on 3 pros and 3 cons in particular in this video, with an aim of reaching a personal conclusion at the end. A binary conclusion of does the watch get to stay or does it have to go? Let me know what you think of the general design of this setup. First, let's have a look at value for money as a pro. I don't profess to be a regular browser of AliExpress. I only really check when their big sales are live, and if I'm honest, I'm heavily influenced by other YouTubers and their recommendations here, because there are an awful lot of watches available on the website. The World Timer appears to be retailing somewhere between £240 and £270 outside of their sales. Now I spent £180 on mine second hand. If you wanted an automatic Swiss-made World Timer watch, you'd be looking at just over or under £1,000 in most cases. There are some really interesting options from Farrer and Christopher Ward that would be my picks around that kind of price range. They are ever so slightly larger and not necessarily suited for the smaller wristed. They'd also be pushing the upper end of the size that I'd be comfortable buying. The Mido Ocean Star, and in particular the Rado Captain Cook Overpole, are more expensive, but come with better sizing, with the Captain Cook a comparatively dainty 37mm. The San Martin by comparison measures in at 39.5mm, which I think is a solid size for most wrists. The World Timer comes with a Seiko NH34 GMT movement, which is common among the new breed of GMT watches available in the budget automatic price range. It also features a rotating world time bezel and a beads of rice bracelet. And while none of that is hugely impressive on its own, finding all 3 in a watch this inexpensive is rare. And that brings me on to my second pro point. This looks and feels like a quality item in hand. The finishing is significantly better than you'd expect from the price, with a mixture of polished and brushed steel surfaces that stand up to some scrutiny under a macro lens. The only downside that I found was one loose bead link that was presumably from the previous owner resizing the watch, not something you get ordering the watch brand new. Though I would say the overall condition of my watch beyond that is pretty fantastic. My genuine first impression trying on the World Timer was just being really impressed by the quality. It certainly looks and feels like a lot more watch than the price would lead you to expect. It's very comfortable, has an excellent clasp that can be resized on the fly quite easily if your wrist swells during the day, and there was enough movement in there that I didn't need to break out any tools to resize this one when it first arrived. Make no mistake, a world timer itself is not a cheap complication. As I mentioned before, the lower end automatic Swiss models are generally starting around the £1,000 mark. If you have a genuine use case, this could be a particularly useful complication to have to help with communication, for work or travel. It also has a unique look and feel to it. It doesn't feel like another generic dive style watch and certainly stands out in a collection or as a talking piece. That isn't to claim that this design from San Martin is original by any means, but it is offered in two different variants, with the black dial version being a little more restrained. Though I have to say, with a bezel like this, I think it's better to fully commit to a busy watch rather than going half and half. I mentioned in a previous video that my Grand Seiko Quartz GMT had become my travel watch. I think this makes a really nice budget companion to it. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a beater, but I certainly wouldn't be worried about wearing it out at night, to the beach or by the pool, as I might with a more expensive watch. So those are the three pros for this video. Now let's start to have a look at the other side of things. Even some of the things that I would normally avoid aren't necessarily negatives in the way that I was expecting with this watch. Normally, I'd avoid a beads of rice bracelet, as I've had one in the past that was a bit of a hair ripper. The bracelet on the San Martin doesn't have those same kind of tight tolerances, so not only is it extremely comfortable, but your arm hairs can rest easy. One negative thing I would highlight is the branding though. I think the San Martin logo has definitely improved in recent years. Much like Christopher Ward, they've moved away from printing the entire brand name and opted for a logo instead. The problem with the new logo is really the lack of contrast in my mind. From a lot of angles, it can just look like a polished piece of metal with no depth or design to it. I'd also say there's something they could have learnt from Mido with the use of colour in the watch dial. A few small hints of colour would have really popped here against the monochromatic design. Another small detail that I'd flag up here is a completely plain caseback, which while functional is certainly not inspirational in any way. Nothing wrong with it, just a missed opportunity in my opinion. My second con for the World Timer isn't necessarily inherent to just this watch, but it could be a deal breaker. This model has a 24-hour dial rather than 12. So reading the time at a glance can be quite confusing if you aren't used to it. It's also not the sort of thing that you can pick up and set without any thought at all at the start of the day. While this makes perfect sense given the complication involved, it does take getting used to and isn't something you'd necessarily expect if it's a quick impulse buy and not something you've put time into researching. Given the function of the watch, I can't say that I look forward to trying to tell the time when getting off a plane bleary-eyed and jet-lagged when I've spent my entire life working to a 12-hour system. For this reason, I don't think you could ever see this watch as a one and done in terms of collecting, but I think it still makes an interesting addition to a wider collection. As you can see from the purchase card, which entitles you to a 2-year warranty, the previous owner had only had the watch for just over a month before selling it on. That leads me to my next con for the watch, and it might sound strange because it's also one of the positives, but a world timer complication is not for everyone. It isn't just the busyness of the dial. Living in the UK, the actual world timer complication can also be quite tricky to get accurate. Daylight savings times can be a real head scratcher. I dare say my personal quibble with the watch is the lack of distinction with the GMT hand. It doesn't stand out from the others enough in my opinion, and certainly it seems an odd design choice when compared to the black dial version. And as this is an AliExpress brand, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to have the watch in your hands before you make a purchase as you might with more common high street retail brands. So making that decision might feel like more of a gamble, because while it's entirely possible to make a return with AliExpress, the time it takes is obviously going to be longer than it would be for a traditional purchase. I'll just briefly add a few further considerations here before we get into the conclusion. First, I'd like to speak about the lume. It's vivid and dual colour, so the watch really pops in the dark. Now, I don't own a UV light to charge it, and the weather has been pretty grim here in the UK this week. These shots were taken after coming in from work, No effort made to expose the watch to light, and I'd say the results are still very strong, especially considering the price point. The other thing I really appreciated about this watch is the packaging. I've often complained on the channel about large fancy boxes that feel great to open but then serve no real purpose afterwards. For a watch with aspirations for travel, this leather case from San Martin is not only a solid offering for the low price point, but it can easily be used as a solid transport option if you don't own a watch roll. From the video reviews I've seen from other models, I think they've shaved some of the height off of these cases recently, making them more compact and better suited for travel. Now, I think you could probably tell where we were going to go from the first moment I mentioned being excited about this watch at the end of my last video. But when it comes to deciding if this is a keeper or a seller, I'd have to say this is about as much of a keeper as it's possible to be in my mind. Not only does it add a new complication to my collection, but it has a use case scenario. A little niche granted, but as a less risky travel watch. Given the price, I think any kind of use case is just fine in my mind. If it sees risk time, that's more than enough. More than that though, this budget-friendly watch has scratched my world timer itch. If I was a Swiss, German or Japanese watchmaker, I'd be starting to get genuinely concerned about the quality on offer from Chinese brands, because the materials and finishing are really impressive at a price point that isn't really on offer elsewhere in a time of real economic struggle. The reliance on homage designs is an issue, I grant you, but San Martin are starting to develop their own original designs, and I can happily say that the World Timer will definitely be an addition to the collection, and has certainly opened my eyes to San Martin as a manufacturer. But what do you think of the watch? Let me know in the comments. I don't want to get into the habit of ending videos like this, with a still screen and me talking about the channel, but obviously I'm trying out a slightly different format for the video today. I want to do a few trial runs with new purchases, as in the long run, that's where the channel will naturally have to evolve. I still have a number of watches that have been in my collection for a long time that I want to make videos on, that have stories and thoughts behind them. But when it comes to new buys, what do you think of this format? I was considering a rating system, but maybe that's a little too hard to quantify. I think this is quite a simple binary way of unpacking my thoughts on a watch and reaching a conclusion, but maybe that isn't the best format for viewers. Let me know any feedback you might have in the comments section. As always, thanks a lot for watching. This video was particularly challenging to make, simply because it took so long to edit out the coughing. I really do appreciate the support. Feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this or found it useful.